You know, the problem with these Fraud Fest gatherings is they're so tame and dull. You know, all this excessive politesse and diplomacy. I don't know what we're going to have to do to get rid of it next year. But once again, I have the dubious honor of being the speaker who stands between you and the exits, both here in Manhattan on a beautiful day and in Oxford on a lovely evening, and wherever your personal venue today might be. And I promise I won't tug at your sleeve for very long. But I do want to put today's program in the context of our Fraud Fest mission, and to offer perhaps a personal perspective on why I think this mission matters so much now in these times. Our hope at the onset for Fraud Fest was that it would tear down the silos from which we look at financial fraud. Other forums, very worthy ones, let journalists share with journalists, lawyers with lawyers, regulators with regulators, and investors with investors. Fraud Fest was born to be a venue where all of the above could share with all of the above. And today's program, more than perhaps any in our short history, truly exemplifies that dream, that hope. We had a legendary short seller talk to us as an increasingly legendary educator about seeing patterns in markets and in history. Thanks to our first ever collaboration with the Center for Corporate Reputation at Oxford, academic experts explained a staggering German tax scandal that cried out for more collaboration among tax authorities and among corporate investigators. And investigative journalists there shared details of remarkable accusations of royal influence peddling in Spain, which had slipped past the radar of the media here in the US. We heard from some of the best investigative journalists in the country about the key role, and sadly, the endangered role the media plays in detecting fraud. And we heard two giants of the judiciary give us their views on how federal and state legal procedures can serve or strangle fraud detection. We explored fraud in formally regulated markets for stocks and for bonds, and we also explored fraud in the informal markets for art and for venture capital. From tax fraud to art fraud, from journalism to the judiciary, from investors to regulators to educators. All of us focused on the eternal challenge of detecting fraud and how necessary collaboration is to do that. The boundary crossing potential of Fraud Fest has never been more fully, or to me, more fascinatingly realized. So thank you to each and every participant and panelist, especially to our Oxford partners for making that happen, and to Delia Villante and all of the people at Berkeley who worked so hard to bring this off. My deepest gratitude as the chair of the advisory panel for the conference. Now, indulge me in a brief personal note. For me, the focus on collaboration exemplified by Fraud Fest seems as urgent now as ever before in our history. We all know how fraud corrodes the trust, the glue that holds our societies together. In my research for a book on how America first came to regulate modern finance nearly 90 years ago, I saw how the predatory activities of the 1920s gave rise to the New Deal anti-fraud reforms of the 1930s. Now, some could argue, and I do, that business in the 1920s made a Faustian bargain with politics. Business got low taxes and little regulation, and politicians got the wealthy support that kept them in power. Fraud and deception were rampant and were widely tolerated. Ultimately, the unmet needs of a nation started ripping society apart. It took a master of collaboration, President Franklin Roosevelt, to hold us together, and it was a near-run thing. I worry that business is making the same Faustian bargain today, ignoring radical and destabilizing forces in hopes of hanging on to lower taxes and less regulation. The unmet needs of the nation are no less urgent now than they were in 1932. And let's face it, a frightened, angry, hostile society is not a healthy place to do business. It is, in fact, a society in which corruption can and will flourish. So maybe Soren's MBA students think that it's really cool to exploit fraud to get rich. I disagree. Every modern economy runs on social trust. Business supports those who undermine that trust at its own peril. So that being said, let's hope that we're all looking at brighter horizons when we gather next year for Fraud Fest. Until then, thank you for participating and good evening.